Nobody tells you what happens after. They show you the photographs, the bearskin hat, the scarlet tunic, the jaw cut from cathedral stone, the eyes that look through you like you are weather. They post the videos online, tourists waving hands in front of a guard's face, pulling his arm, pressing in close for selfies with their teeth out. Laughing, always laughing. The guard doesn't blink. The guard doesn't breathe wrong. The guard stands there and takes it because that is what the crown asks of him, and the crown does not ask small things. They never show you what happens in the 3 seconds after the tourist crosses the line. Not the shove line, not the legal line. The other one, the invisible one drawn not by law, but by something older, something that lives in the chest of a man who has buried a brother in arms, stood post in 40-degree heat in 17 kilograms of wool and brass, and still showed up the next morning because the alternative was becoming the kind of man who didn't. I was there the day it happened. I was standing close enough to smell the tourists' sunscreen. I have been writing incident reports for 11 years. I have documented protests, medical emergencies, a sitting MP who tried to sneak through a service entrance in a catering uniform. I thought I had seen the full catalog of human stupidity as it applies to palace grounds. I had not. Or what I watched that afternoon, what Guardsman Thomas Carver did and did not do in the space of 30 seconds, rearranged something in me I have not yet managed to put back in the right order. This is not a story about a tourist being foolish. This is a story about what it costs a man to be immovable, and what happens to him the day something finally moves. The log entry reads, 1407. Incident at Sentry Box C. Guardsman T. Carver involved. No injuries sustained. Full debrief pending. 11 words. I wrote them myself, sitting in the security office with my tea going cold and my hand doing that thing it does when I've witnessed something I don't have the right vocabulary for, tapping the pen against my knuckle, once, twice, 3 times, like I'm sending a message to myself in a code I haven't cracked yet. Let me tell you what actually happened. The afternoon had been standard issue miserable. Well, August in London does this thing where it can't decide if it wants to rain or suffocate you, so it does both. Gray sky pressing down like a thumb, air thick with bus exhaust, and the particular pungent sweetness of a tourist crowd that has walked too far in the wrong shoes. I was doing a walkthrough of the outer posts. Routine. I had my clipboard. I had my lukewarm tea in a flask I've been meaning to replace for 3 years. I was checking faces, checking posture, checking that none of our lads had gone glassy-eyed from standing in the same position since 9:30 that morning. Carver was at Sentry Box C. I noticed him the way you notice a full stop at the end of a sentence. Not consciously, just as the thing that tells you the line is complete. He was exactly as he should be. 6'1" in the bearskin, shoulders back, rifle at his side, eyes fixed on the middle distance where the tourists weren't, which is the only place a sentry is allowed to look. His tunic had a small mark on the left breast pocket, something that had been polished over rather than properly cleaned, and it caught the flat light in a way that made it look almost like a medal that wasn't there. I made a note to mention it later. I did not mention it later. The tourist arrived the way they always do. In a group, then slightly ahead of the group, then separate from it entirely, because somewhere between the gift shop and the guardhouse, and a particular species of person decides that rules are communal objects and do not apply to individuals who've paid for a flight. She was American. I don't say that as an insult. I say it the way a doctor says left-handed, as a data point that helps explain the subsequent events. She was perhaps 40, in a yellow waterproof jacket that had never seen actual weather, and she had the camera out before she'd fully stopped walking, and which told me everything I needed to know about her relationship with the present moment. She stood in front of Carver. He looked through her. She waved. He did not blink. She leaned in close, camera raised, and her friend on the path called something encouraging in the tone people use when they're filming for social media and need the talent to perform. She laughed. reached out, touched the side of his arm. Just a tap. The kind of contact so brief it almost has a legal defense built in, and said loudly enough that I heard it from 6 meters. "Come on, soldier. Just one smile." Carver did not smile. She touched him again. Higher on the arm this time. I was already moving. Not running. You do not run at the palace unless something is on fire or someone has a weapon, because running panics people, and a panicked crowd on a public forecourt is its own kind of weapon. But I was moving with purpose, which is to say I had my hand on my radio, and I was closing the distance in the way you do when you can see a thing about to happen and you're calculating whether you can stop it. I was not going to stop it. What I mean is, I was not going to stop Carver. He moved in a way I had never seen him move. Not violently. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters and the official language of the report had to be precise. Di and I spent 40 minutes choosing the right words for what his body did in those seconds. He did not strike her. He did not shove her. He did not break formation in any way that the regulations would classify as a disciplinary matter. He turned his head. That's all. He turned his head and he looked at her. Not through her. At her. And whatever the middle distance had been doing to his face all morning, that ancient, practiced blankness, at the expression trained into these men the way a river is trained into a channel, it was gone, just gone, like a light turned off. What was underneath it was not anger. That's what stopped me. That's what stopped her. I don't know what I expected. Fury, maybe. The contained kind, professional and cold. Something that could be written up, managed, filed. What was underneath the blankness was exhaustion, not the tiredness of a man who hasn't slept. The other kind. The kind that comes from doing something difficult every single day in front of people who don't understand what the difficulty costs. The kind that lives behind the eyes, not in them. He held her gaze for perhaps 4 seconds. She lowered the camera. He turned his head back to the middle distance. And he was gone again. Back into the sentry. Back into the ceremonial stillness. Back into the thing that the crown required of him. As if those 4 seconds had not happened. And as if they had been a door that opened and closed so fast that only the people directly in front of it knew it had moved at all. The tourist walked back to her group. She didn't say anything to them. That was the part that got me. She didn't narrate it, didn't perform it for the camera she was still holding. She just rejoined them quietly, her yellow jacket very bright against the gray. I stood there with my radio in my hand and my tea going cold in my other hand, and I thought, what is it that I just saw? I filed the 11-word report. Then I sat at my desk and I started writing a different one. The one I wasn't going to submit. The one that asked the question I didn't know I had until I watched Carver put himself back together in real time like a man reassembling a wall he's knocked down 1,000 times before. What does it take to be that still? And what does that stillness cost when nobody's watching? I wrote the question down. I did not write an answer. I didn't have one yet. He was off duty by 3:30. I know because I checked the rota. Not for any official reason. There was no official reason. The 11-word report had seen to that. But because I had been sitting with the question from that afternoon, and I had decided, in the way that middle-aged security officers sometimes decide things that are probably above their station, that I needed to understand something. I found him in the mess, not eating, just sitting with a mug of something in both hands, staring at the surface of the table in the concentrated, slightly blank way of a man who is physically present and somewhere else entirely. His bearskin was off. His tunic was hung on the back of the chair in that carefully imprecise way. Not careless, not precise. The hang of a man who cares very much but has no energy left to demonstrate it. Without the uniform architecture around him, he looked younger than I'd calculated, which happens sometimes with the guards because the kit adds decades, and when you take it off, you find out who's actually inside it. He was 24. I had not known that before this moment. I sat across from him. He looked up. He didn't look surprised to see me, which either meant he'd been expecting something like this, or he'd moved past the point where surprise was a resource he could afford. "Ah, sir," he said. Reflex. The word doesn't mean anything when it comes out that automatic. I asked him how he was doing. He said he was fine. We sat with that for a moment. The mess was mostly empty, the kitchen producing a low industrial sound in the background, something boiling, a radio somewhere doing the afternoon news in a tinny voice that couldn't quite be made out. It smelled of old gravy and floor polish and the institutional clean smell of a building that gets cleaned too aggressively to mask the fact that it's tired. "I saw what happened," I said. "At post." He didn't move. His hand stayed on the mug. "I'm aware, sir. The report says nothing happened." "That's correct, sir. I'm not here about the report." Something in his face shifted. Not relief, not quite. More like the settling of a structure that's been under load, and a beam finally allowed to do what beams are meant to do. "Right," he said. Just that. Right. I asked him how long he'd been in the battalion. 2 years, he told me, passed out of training 18 months after he'd decided that the job he was doing, warehouse logistics, a town outside Coventry that I'd never heard of and whose name sounded like a clearing of the throat, was going to hollow him out before he was 30. He'd signed up because a mate had signed up, in which is the honest reason more men join than anyone puts in the recruitment materials. I asked about the mate. He answered by looking at his mug for a long time. I didn't ask again. What I knew about Carver from his file, which I'd pulled after I'd started writing the question report I wasn't going to submit. Joined at 22, exemplary standing, 1 commendation for conduct during an incident the file referred to only as the February situation. So, which was the kind of bureaucratic phrasing that tells you exactly how serious something was by how carefully it avoided being specific. No disciplinary history. No sick days that stood out. The kind of file that is so clean it starts to look like evidence of something, though I couldn't have told you what. Does it happen often? I asked. People touching you? Often enough, he said. And you just... I made a gesture that was meant to indicate the standing, the stillness, or the infinite patience of a man being poked at, like an exhibit. Yeah, he said. You just. He said it the way people say things that are so true they've stopped being interesting. The flatness of it was its own kind of weight. I asked him what he thought about while he was standing. Hours of it. The ceremony, the precision, the particular torture of holding a position in your body while your mind has to go somewhere else or go mad. And he was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I count things. A pause. Railings. Cobbles. Sometimes I try to estimate distances. Figure out how many of a thing would fit in a space. He stopped, looked faintly embarrassed, as if he'd confided something he'd meant to keep architectural. Stupid. It's not, I said. It keeps the edges sharp, he said. You go soft in there. He touched his temple, just briefly. 2 fingers. Yeah, like pressing a bruise to check if it still hurts. You start to drift. And if you drift, you miss things. And missing things is the one thing we actually can't do. I thought about the tourist, her hand on his arm, the way he'd looked at her. What did you see? I asked. When you looked at her. He put his mug down. Careful. The kind of careful that means the hands need something to do. Nothing she'd want to know, he said. I waited. You're someone who didn't understand that the stillness is the job, he said. Not the costume part, not the ceremony, He stopped. Worked on it. The thing underneath the ceremony, the readiness. You can't be ready and also be performing being ready. They're different. And everyone who comes up wanting a reaction... He stopped again. They think still means empty. They want to prove it. That's why they touch. He picked the mug back up. Both hands, same as before. She wasn't being malicious, he said. They never are. What are they being? He looked at me with the eyes of a 24-year-old who has been counted and measured and looked through on a daily basis by strangers with cameras, and he said the one thing I had not expected from him. Lonely, mostly. I sat with that. He finished his tea. I walked back to my office and I looked at the 11-word report, and I thought about the mate from the file whose name Carver hadn't said. On the February situation nobody had named, and the way a man can count railings for 8 hours and still notice the loneliness of someone poking him with a finger to see if he's real. I did not add to the report. I opened a new document and started writing. I didn't know what it was yet. The file landed on my desk 4 days later. Not officially. Officially, but the file on the February situation was sealed under a review classification that someone senior had applied and which I did not have the clearance to override. What landed on my desk was a manila envelope, no markings, slid under my office door sometime between my 7 o'clock start and the moment I came back from the kitchen at 1:15 with my tea, and which contained 6 photocopied pages and a post-it note that read, in handwriting I didn't recognize, "You're asking the right questions." I'd stop before someone notices. I should have stopped. I am the kind of man who notices when he is being warned and takes the warning seriously and files it in the part of his brain that deals with information he was never supposed to have and then continues anyway, which is a character flaw I've made peace with and my ex-wife would describe as the central feature of our marriage's collapse. I sat down. I read all 6 pages. I drank my tea. I read them again. February. McCarver's first winter on post. A security conference, the kind the palace hosts twice a year, all dress uniforms and shuffling dignitaries, and the kind of catered reception where the canapes are designed to be held and not eaten. Carver had been on interior corridor rotation, not ceremonial, operational, which is a different deployment and a different state of mind, the kind where the stillness is tactical rather than symbolic. What the file recorded, in the clipped and bloodless language of official incident review, was this. A man had breached the East Corridor. Not violently. He'd come in attached to a catering company with apparently legitimate credentials that had, in the subsequent investigation, turned out to have been fabricated with a sophistication that suggested something considerably more resourced than a lone operator. He'd walked 20 meters into the restricted section before the credential check caught it. Carver had been the nearest officer. The report described his response as proportionate and decisive, which in official incident language is the equivalent of standing ovation. What the 6 pages described in slightly more human terms was a 22-year-old on his 4th operational month who had clocked the man's pace before the credential alert sounded. Something in the walk. The report quoted him saying, "See the way he was counting steps without looking like he was counting steps," and had made a judgment call that cost him 3 nights of interview with internal security and a medical evaluation for what the form labeled post-incident stress response and what the doctor's notes, in the last photocopied page, described more specifically as inability to sleep, recurring ideation around operational outcome scenarios, persistent hypervigilance inconsistent with scope of incident. And he'd been cleared for full duty in 6 weeks. The mate from Coventry was in the report. 3 lines, which is the official volume for a thing that doesn't have a neater container. He'd left the regiment 8 weeks after February. Medical discharge. The form used a category code I didn't need to look up. I sat there. The pen tapping had moved to my knee, which is what it does when the pen isn't enough. I was doing the thing I do with information I can't put in a report, turning it over, and looking for the edge, trying to find the shape of what I was actually dealing with. What I was actually dealing with was this. Carver had known. Before the systems. Before the alert. He'd read the man's body in a corridor the way I watched him read a tourist's reach on a forecourt. And he'd acted on what he'd read, and it had cost him something the medical form documented in category codes, and he'd come back to post 6 weeks later and stood there, and stood there, and stood there, counting railings against the drift, carrying the mate's absence in the place where the weight of a specific conversation used to be. I thought about what he'd said. Still doesn't mean empty. I thought about the tourist and her camera and the particular hunger of wanting a reaction from something that seems like it might not be entirely real. I thought about how we come to these men. All of us, and tourists and senior officers and women in yellow waterproofs, with our own versions of the poke and see. The prod that asks, are you a person or are you a monument? I thought about the 4 seconds, the exhaustion underneath the blankness, what it costs to carry that particular weight and still show up to be photographed. I put the 6 pages back in the envelope. I was going to destroy them. That was clearly the intended architecture of the whole arrangement, read and burn. The kind of message that comes under doors in buildings where certain things are understood without being said. I held the envelope for a long time. Then I put it in the locked drawer of my desk that I haven't lost the key to yet, which is not the same as destroying something, but in this building is close enough to pass. I went down to Sentry Box C. Carver was on morning post. He was exactly as he should be, which is the whole point, which I was only now beginning to fully understand. Bearskin. A tunic, shoulders, eyes fixed on the place tourists aren't. The small mark on the breast pocket that I had still not mentioned. The stillness that was not emptiness, that was in fact its opposite, a readiness so total it had learned to wear the face of vacancy. A family walked past, father, 2 children. One of the children, a boy, maybe 7, genuinely delighted in the way that small children are delighted before the world teaches them that delight is a resource to be rationed. Stopped and stared up at Carver with his mouth open. Just looking. Not touching, not demanding, not pointing a camera. Just looking at this enormous, still, scarlet man the way you look at something that strikes you as genuinely improbable. Carver's eyes moved, not his head, his eyes. Down, are just a fraction, the smallest possible movement of a man who is not permitted to make movements. And he looked at the boy for 1 second. The boy grinned. Carver's eyes moved back. The family walked on. I turned around and went back to my office, and I did not write anything down. Some things I have learned are smaller than reports. Some things are smaller than language. Some things are just a man counting railings in the dark, keeping his edges sharp. I'm waiting for something that might never come, or might come in the next 10 seconds. The envelope is still in the drawer. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. I'm not sure I'm supposed to.